Yeah, I think I can do it.
I think it should.
Okay,
Yep,
awesome,
it's
awesome.
working.
Okay.
Okay, so it works.
Okay, so I think, is everybody ready in the conference room to get started?
So are you are you next to the conference room, Jody?
I'm like down the hall from it, but
What?
I know I should probably physically move, but like I'm here. Okay, so I'm gonna do a quick intro for you, Jeff. And sorry, I didn't plan anything, but you know, we're so lucky to have Jeff Franco. Some of you may know him. Jeff has been a candidate for us at Korn Ferry. He's been a great friend. I know him the last, I think, 5+ years of my time in DC, and he has tremendous valuable experience as a CEO of nonprofit organizations, City Year, and now he's been in a consultant role working with dozens and dozens of great nonprofit organizations, helping them with leadership and so forth, coaching CEOs and a vast array of different consulting opportunities. So we asked Jeff to talk to us all today about building our brand. He has firsthand experience in a CEO capacity, building his own brand, and then as an entrepreneur, starting up a consulting firm, which has become pretty successful in the past few years. So hopefully we're gonna all learn a lot today and be interactive. And I'm gonna turn it over to you, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Jody. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here. I was honored and humbled and confused that Jody would even ask me to do this, but I am excited to be here. I've had a lot of interaction, as Jody mentioned, with Korn Ferry that started with Jody on an opportunity. Gosh, Jody, I think that was at least 3 years ago. And she ended up becoming a dear friend. And I mean, I guess in the context of brand building, I guess that was not necessarily the intention, but you know, I think that's an important piece of relationships. And I like the word building a personal brand about as much as I like the word networking, and I'll get to that in a moment. And I don't think I have the market cornered on what it means to build a strong personal brand. So I'm just going to tell you my story, and hopefully there's a couple of nuggets of wisdom you can get from it. So I have a slide deck, so I'm going to share my screen. And I always get nervous when this happens because I always feel like something's going to go wrong. I should be more positive. Can you see my screen? Yes? Okay. I'm going to put it into, can you all see everything okay? Just want to make sure, because I can see it. I want to make sure you can. Okay. So just a little bit more background on me. So I'm currently the CEO of a firm I started called Keynote Consulting Group. And during the pandemic, my pandemic baby was Transformation Leadership Institute, but Keynote Consulting Group is my background's in the nonprofit space. I ran an organization called City Year for about 12 years here in DC. And in my role now is I work with nonprofits, nonprofit leaders on everything under the sun that deals with the nonprofit space, from board development, fundraising, strategic planning, succession planning, everything that I learned over my time. I decided to try to see if I could kind of hang my own shingle up, and it's been a lot of fun. And so during that time, I've also been, looking at different opportunities to get back involved in organizational leadership, but have been enjoying this in the meantime. TLI is a cohort-based leadership organization. With a partner of mine, we do about 6-month cohorts for a nonprofit executive director. So we just finished our 3rd cohort recently, and it is all a community building, peer sharing, best practice sharing institute that we bring together every cohort in between 10 and 20 nonprofit executives from across the country and do trainings as well as one-on-one individual executive coaching. I'm also an adjunct professor at University of Maryland. I teach a course in nonprofit management and leadership, as well as at American University. Just to make sure my screens are advancing, right? Because I've had this problem before. You seeing overall objectives right now?
Yep, all good, Jeff.
Thank you, Jody. Okay, so just quickly, I'm going to try to really delve into this and take a stab at my perspective on brand awareness. So I may have a little bit of a different perspective on it, so I'll provide and share that with you. Also, talking about leadership, I mean, that's a big thing of what I'm doing now in coaching EDs, discussing how leadership and brand are intertwined, clarify how leadership and how it impacts one's own personal brand, and then just thoughts in terms of how to strengthen one's brand. I mean, I never really thought in terms of how do I build or strengthen my personal brand. But I think I certainly, in retrospect, have learnings that I think may be helpful. So this is my favorite quote. It's something that I lived by, certainly at City Year, which is a vocation is the intersection of one's greatest desire with the world's greatest need. I think that aspirationally, everyone should want to stand that intersection. I think that if you connect this to brand building, it happens really effortlessly. It's not really your intention to build a brand, it's your intention to focus on your vocation. But I think where I learned a lot when it comes to the branding piece. And I work with a lot of young people. As you can imagine, City Year is a youth-based nonprofit, and certainly with my students. And I'm always trying to impress this upon them. Most of the world has a job, but very few are lucky enough to have a vocation. And if you have the privilege to be able to seek one, you should seek one. And having had one, I realized what a difference that made in my life. Okay, so first thing I want to talk about is leadership. Okay, so I think this is certainly a phrase that's thrown around quite a bit. I think a lot of people feel like the leader is whoever is the ED or CEO of an organization. This is true, but I think everyone has their own leadership aspects they need to look at. I also think that the leadership journey is not just leading from the front. I think this is, again, something that a lot of young leaders think that that's what it means. It means to be a CEO and standing at the front of the pack, leading the charge. It is that and everything else. It's, I think, a real solid and really transformational leader is one that can be very versatile, knowing when to lead from the front, when to lead from behind, when to lead within their own field, when to lock arms with the person you're working with, and just knowing what your own internal leadership compass is. So at my organization, I was at City Year, I had about 44 staff members. And on my executive team, I always told them my preference is to lead from behind with you. I want you to look at each of your departments as if you're the executive director of that particular department. And I will be there and support you at every turn. And when there is a need for me to step in front or to lock arms with you, I will do so. But it's my job as a leader to know when I'm supposed to be in what space as a leader. So it's not always, having the fanfare in front of everything. Sometimes it's really understanding what leadership really means. And being a leader is not necessarily being a CEO or ED of a nonprofit. Any position in an organization, you should really be focusing on what your leadership compass is. Another thing that I have always said is, SWOT analysis has certainly been around quite a long time. We oftentimes do SWOT analyses on organizations, but I've always encouraged leaders to do their own personal SWOT analysis on themselves. To really try to understand what their own strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are. This is something that I have done a lot, but I've also done it with other leaders. It's very hard for me to be navel gazing in my own little echo chamber to just declare what my strengths and weaknesses are. I get a lot more finding out what my blind spots are, which end up being my weaknesses, by having other people help me decipher that. And so, for whatever leadership, wherever you are on your leadership journey, I would encourage you to consider doing it, because we're always looking at this as an organizational tool. I also do a lot of training with nonprofit boards, and I'm also telling them, let's do the SWOT analysis on the organization, but have we done a SWOT analysis on ourselves, on the organization, on a board that serves at this organization? So I think that's a really important thing to consider. It's a tried and true tool that's used quite a bit, but I think we oftentimes see it as an organizational tool and not as a personal tool. And then the last thing I would say is in regards to the leadership compass is, and I think this is such a key question to ask, is what is your superpower, right? I mean, I'm sure you probably all heard this before, but I think that, and I use this exercise a lot with boards, in which I ask each board member to state what is his or her superpower as it relates to them sitting at the seat at the table of this board of directors. And then once they say what their superpower is, or what they think it is, then the executive director or CEO has already done the homework in declaring what he or she thinks that person's superpower is. And it's always very interesting to hear what the board member's perspective is and what the executive director or CEO's perspective is of that superpower. But I mean, a superpower is what it is, right? It's something that you are really good at naturally, that you have kind of an ability to thrive at it, and maybe even better than most. If I were to say what my superpower is my love and ability to cultivate, steward, and build relationships. I just naturally love doing it. It has been at the foundation of everything I've done and any type of success I've had in the workspace. And I think it's important for you to recognize, just as much as your own blind spots, what is that superpower, and to really lean into it. And I think that when I talked about vocation, that's certainly something I found at City Year. I was able to kind of do a whole kind of analysis of what was happening during that whole experience for me. And I realized that that superpower was what really made me effective, because I was quite external in the role. I had to raise a lot of money. I had to enroll. By enroll, I mean touch, move, and inspire people to get excited about our organization. And it came naturally to me. I loved doing it. And, if you were to come during my time at City Year to a party at my house, you would see a bunch of friends and a bunch of board members and funders for our organization, because I like bringing people together. So I think it's important to ask yourself what that superpower that you have, and are you utilizing it and taking advantage of it in the role that you're currently in? And if you're not, it's probably a moment of pause as to if it's the right role, or why you're not able to kind of use that superpower in the work that you're doing. So this goes back to something I was talking about with the personal brand. I said I liked it about as much as the word networking. What I have come to find, and again, this always leans into what I say is something that is a bliss for me, which is being able to build relationships. Is DC is particularly is a networking town. That word is thrown around quite a bit. There's nothing wrong with the word networking. I just think that I would invite us to revisit what we use in terms of networking and relationship world building, because I think they're similar and very different at the same time. So to me, networking sounds very transactional, right? If I am networking with Jody, it's because Jody has something or knows somebody that I need to get from her. It sounds very transactional. It sounds very unidirectional. I'm getting something from her, right? Whereas a relationship world sounds interactional. It feels intertwined and symbiotic. If I am entering into a relationship world with Jody, which I did whatever number of years ago, the first question I'm usually asking is, what makes Jody tick? Is there a way that I can help her in some way? And then organically, there's going to be some way that there's a symbiotic, her helping me helping her. But it just seems much more exciting when you think about a relationship world. What I always tell my class, and I would say to this group here, I haven't met you all yet, but just by the very nature of me speaking in front of you, I have at some level entered into a relationship world with you, right? Now, what happens from that remains to be seen, but it is now something that grows. And because I love relationship worlds, I get excited just by the idea that there's new people in my relationship world. Finally, relationship worlds are more inclusive and transcend a professional network. What I mean by that is, if you think of the word networking, you think of that very much in a professional context, right? You're networking with somebody as it relates to whatever entity, organization you might be involved in. Whereas a relationship world is much more expansive, right? I'm in a relationship world with Jody as a friend and a board member at an organization. I'm also in a relationship world with my mother, father, brother, sister. So those are all part of the relationship world. Some are professional, some are personal. But if you look at it in a much more expansive way, then I think that changes the game quite a bit. Because if that is your focus on building, cultivating, stewarding your relationship world, then to me at least, I am not going into interaction with somebody saying, well, I don't understand why I'm meeting this person. Like, what's this person serve in terms of what I'm doing? This is another human being. I'm in a relationship world. hard stop, right? That's all that matters to me in that. And so I think that's a way to look at it. And as the kind of the photo implies, they are intertwining relationships. So each one of you has a relationship world that may be small, may be large. What I always told boards at nonprofits was, if I am the CEO of a nonprofit and I have 10 relationships in my relationship world here in DC, and each one of those members has 10 relationships, just by being able to access their relationship world, I have 10 times the world of relationships that I had on my own. And would I be a good fundraiser if I had, and I always like to think of things in extremes, would I be a good fundraiser if I had some level of relationship with every person who lived in the District of Columbia? It's a definitive yes, right? Now, I don't have a relationship with every person in District of Columbia, but it shows how powerful the relationships are. And I think relationships are so transferable. They're critically important at Korn Ferry. They're critically important at General Motors. They're critically important at City Year. They just are the bedrock of someone being able to have success in the work that they're doing. So this is why I don't like using the word networking, and why I like using the word relationship world. And this just goes into a little more detail on that. I see once I am in a relationship with somebody, I really treat that as sacred. I used to meet with my AmeriCorps members once a month. I would take usually one day out of the month from like 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock at night and just meet one-on-one with them, because I love meeting with these young people and seeing what their dreams were, and then thinking of my relationship world and who I could connect them to, which would be great for them to get skill sets and how to interact with adults that are working in the business world or whatever they may be. It was also a great tool to get that person involved with City Year, because they got inspired by this young person and they wanted to get involved. But I always told our young people, treat that relationship like a plant that needs to be watered. So if I meet you once on the street and introduce to you and we share some nice words and go on our way, the relationship is going to be what's going to be. There's nothing bad about it, but when you start watering that plant, right? And especially certainly when I was introducing these young people to people that had been around the block of life a few more times, I was like, that person's not responsible for watering that plant. That's your responsibility, because I was huge on the idea of mentorship, that these people could be mentors for them. Trust is a real big piece of this. Is another thing I'd always tell my young people, which is there's a reason why, and this is an assumption, but there's a reason why I believe when I reach out to John Doe in my relationship world, say, John, would you meet with my AmeriCorps member, Stacy? She's interested in medicine and you're a doctor and I'd love her to get to learn from you. I would say, I can't think of a time that someone didn't say no to that, right? And I think part of the reason was I did a thoughtful job of stewarding that relationship I had with that person. And so that's why that's so very important to me, of the relationship I have, whether it be just a professional one or professional/personal, that they hear from me and say, oh yeah, I'd like to help Jeff out, or I'd be happy to be connected to this person. And again, that transcends to sales, that transcends to fundraising, it transcends to enrolling somebody, touch, move, and inspire them to want to help you in your relationship world. And in expanding your perspective, again, is something that I mentioned before about it's incredibly expansive. If you're just talking about who are my relationships or my network within Korn Ferry, it's probably big in some respect, but on another level, it's so darn small, right? Like you can go way beyond that, and there can be loose ties to Korn Ferry or no ties at all. But I just think that it's an expansive way to look at one's relationship world. So just going into the brand now, I just some thoughts on it. I think brand building, and this is really getting into the mechanics of it, which is something that I don't think a lot about, but in retrospect, I think that I have kind of done that. I think it's an art and a science. The art is the fun part. The art is where the magic happens, but there is some science piece to it, which we certainly can go over. And I don't think it's anything earth-shattering things I'm going to say, but it's an art and a science. I think that the best brand builders are ones that are really good storytellers and they have an ever evolving narrative. So I think we're all storytellers, and I think that we learn from each other's stories. And what I always tell, my class that I teach is when we're talking about a particular topic on a particular component, I will say, well, let me tell you a story of something that happened to me that has relationship to what we're talking about tonight. And so I just think that if you think about some of the best storytellers out there are the ones that really are compelling, the ones you really pay attention to. And I think that's an important part of building your brand. And I keep going back to this whole idea of touch, moving, inspiring other people. I think that when I look back on my work at City Year, I think that I enrolled lots of people because they saw this genuine passion. I believed I was in a vocation. I was amazed they were even paying me to do it. And it inspired others to want to get involved in one way or the other. And so I was able to continue expanding my own relationship world, but also the relationship world for the organization I represented. And I think that to talk about touch, moving, inspiring somebody, it is very much the art piece of the brand building, right? I almost feel like the brand building and touch, move, inspire are almost like butt heads with one another, but it does build your brand, and what branding means your reputation. And I think that is really important, but I also think it's important to have perspective on it. We had a gala every year at City Year. We usually would have about 600 to 800 people attend these galas. And I would speak at the gala every year. We usually had at the Washington Hilton. And I would memorize my speeches. I didn't like speaking at a podium. It was a lot more work, but I wanted the crowd to feel like I was walking on the stage and talking with them as opposed to reading off a sheet of paper. And we always would have a AmeriCorps member, again, someone who was just out of college, to do what we called a impact story or a starfish story, in which he or she would come onto the stage. We also would train them to memorize their speech and talk about what impact they were having in the school. And it was truly inspiring because these are young people that weren't used to being in front of a big group like this. But I do remember one particular year, I was backstage getting ready to go on, and she was back there with me. And I was just talking to her, trying to see if she was feeling, calm about everything. And she said, "Aren't you nervous?" And I said, "Yeah, I get nervous every time before I go out there." And she's like, "Well, aren't you worried what they're going to think about you?" And I said, once I step out on that stage, there's 600 people out there, which means I am going to have 600 reputations going right then and there. I have no control over what those people think of me. Now, I'm a human being. I hope they like me. I hope they love me. It would be much rather have them like me than to not like me. The difference is I don't need it, right? And I think that is aspirational because we all want validation. We all want to be liked. I don't not like not to be liked. But once I start needing it, then my why in terms of how I'm moving in the world is really just so that you can validate what I'm doing. And my decisions and what I decide to do is based on you accepting it or not accepting it. And so that is something I've tried to be very self-aware of as I've moved in the world, especially, in my professional life, is that, yes, I want to be liked. With the relationship world, you want to build these strong relationships. I never want to need it. I never want to have to make decisions based on whether you will like me or not like me. And so I think that's where the touch, move, inspire piece comes in, and the art piece about one's personal brand. So this is kind of like some building blocks, I'd say, to a personal brand, things that I have seen over time. So I'll go through them quickly. One, discover your vocation. I think that, not everyone has had a vocation. I don't think I had a vocation per se until I was leading this organization here. But I think that we should always be on the lookout for it. Also be understanding that, when I look back on my professional life and think about a job that I was in that I didn't like at all and felt pretty miserable there at it, I realize in retrospect that had I not had that miserable experience, I never would have had the vocation. So I think it's important to continually look for that vocation and to seek it. It's a high bar, but I think that that's what I'm always looking for, is what my next vocation is. The second one is identify your personal motivators. I spelled it wrong. This is an exercise that I went through with a leadership coach some years ago while I was at City Year. And basically, it's an exercise, and I'm happy to share it with the group afterwards. I can email it to Jody. It's a list of 40 to 50 motivators, right? So like, I like to work in groups. I like to work alone. I want to make a lot of money. I want to change the world. It's an exercise where you identify and narrow down your top 3 personal motivators, which sounds easy, but I went through this exercise and it was easy to narrow it down to 10. It was very difficult to narrow it down to 5 or 3. And it's a great way for me, because once I did that, my number 1 personal motivator, I still have it on the butcher paper we were working on, gosh, 15 years ago. I kept it, and it was independence, that I loved my independence and my freedom. And when I went through those top 3 to 5 personal motivators, I realized, and the coach had told me this, that it was perfectly aligned with my roles at the organization, which was why I was thriving. And so it really made me think about other opportunities that I would have after that and where I would be, making sure it was aligned with my personal motivators, right? So like, I know clearly that if I am offered a job, or I am a head of an organization and I get paid more money than I could ever have imagined, if I have a lot of things that impede my freedom to try to be creative and to be my own artist in the way I move about in the work that I do, that I won't be happy. And so like, I have this awareness now that I didn't have before. So I think that's important. Build your story. This is, again, goes back to the storytelling. If I'll oftentimes do this, I oftentimes do it at a restaurant. For some reason, when I have a server, I'm always curious about their story, and I'll just ask out of the blue, "What's your story?" And they always act surprised, and they're like, "Well, what do you mean?" And I'm like, "Well, who are you? Like, how did you get here?" And invariably, they go into this, they start telling their story, and they like telling their story, and I like hearing their story. So what is your story, right? How do you enroll somebody into your story? Cultivate and steward your relationship world. I mean, cultivate and stewardship are 2 real words that's used all the time in the nonprofit space, certainly in fundraising. So it can be seen as the science piece of it, but thinking about the relationships that you have and how are you stewarding those relationships you have, right? So in the nonprofit world, you cultivate a relationship to get a gift. And then once you get that gift, now you're stewarding that relationship to hope you get a renewal of that gift at the end of the year. This is the same type of thing in any professional personal context in terms of relationships that you have, right? And I'm always thinking about my relationships, and am I doing a proper job of stewarding a relationship, which sounds a little clunky. Like, I don't think I ever say, how am I stewarding my relationship with my mother? But I am thinking about, am I keeping in touch? Am I like having back and forth? It's easy to get caught up in our own worlds and forget about some people. Curate your LinkedIn. So I love LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. I have Instagram. I rarely use them, but LinkedIn, from a professional standpoint, I think is amazing, right? I think that when I say curated, I mean really looking at your LinkedIn and making sure it is a proper reflection of all the things that you've done in your professional life. The great thing about LinkedIn is that it can be much more expansive than a CV that you're sending in a Word document. So I always am looking at that and making sure, or trying to see if that LinkedIn profile, in its own way, you'll never do it as good as me being able to tell it myself, but can it tell a story of who I am and how I've gotten there? And then verifying social media alignment. What I mean by that is, and I mentioned I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram, as much as I don't use those sites really, I do want to make sure that they don't tell a completely different story of who it is that I am. Now, LinkedIn's very different. It's a professional social media option, but I also want to make sure that there is a common thread that goes through all of those of who it is that I am, right? And that's not inventing it, it's just making sure it is authentic in terms of how I'm describing or what I'm experiencing or what I'm putting on social media. Show up. We probably all heard this phrase, I think 95% of accomplishing anything is just showing up. And so I just try to make sure I'm reminding myself to show up. So right now I'm not at my office. I'm at there's an organization, nonprofit called Build, and they asked me to serve as a judge for their case competitions they're doing with their young people at Roosevelt High School. And I'm a champion of young people, and I love supporting any way I can. And so I had to move my schedule around so I could go there and make sure they had Wi-Fi for me in a private room so I could do this call that I'm doing now. But I wanted to show up. That was important to me. And so it's important to think about also being out there. I think showing up, my goodness, I think with the pandemic, I've always described myself as an introspective extrovert, but I probably became more introverted during the pandemic, and it took me a little more energy to like convince myself to go to whatever I was going to, and which came very natural to me for quite a while. I think it's really important to kind of get that muscle moving again in terms of showing up to things, whether it be events or, networking events or having lunch with people. It just being there without necessarily an expectation what's to happen. So I think the show up piece is more important now, quasi post pandemic, than it ever was. And then last but not least, I would say I love the phrase humble swag and powerful vulnerability. And by that, I mean, have a level of humility in terms of how you move in the world, but having humility does not mean don't have confidence. And so I try to, as much as I can, strike that of having humility, having like inquisitiveness, having a desire to be constructively criticized and things that I'm doing so I can get better, but also having this inherent confidence in who it is that I am. Certainly, when you go through all the job searches and the ones that don't work out, that certainly can be a punch in the gut for the ego. And I think it always puts this type of thing to a great test. But I do think that having, the humility with confidence to me is humble swag. And so I think those are all really strong components to building a personal brand. And I do really believe if you are living an authentic life, that building the personal brand kind of happens to some extent without you thinking about it. Now, you have to think about putting your LinkedIn together. If you get connected to someone that's related to work, you need to make sure you're cultivating and stewarding that relationship in a thoughtful, professional way. But I do think that when you are, and this goes back to the first quote I put there, which is the intersection of your greatest desire with the world's greatest need is your vocation. And then when you stand at that intersection, then this brand idea becomes something that's kind of like second nature and really happens naturally. And there's nothing like seeing somebody who naturally goes about in the world that is not trying to kind of get points for what they're doing. There was a gentleman who I was asking to be an honoree for our gala one year, and he was a pretty big deal, and I'd never met him before. One of my board members connected to him. And I remember, I went to his office. He had this beautiful, huge, expansive office. And there's very few people you meet that had this ability where when I was there, I felt like I was the only person in the room and that all he wanted to do was know about me, which kind of blew me away because was much more accomplished than I was. But I think this is kind of part of that humble swag that I'm talking about. Like having that inquisitiveness about others made me enrolled to him and who he was as a person and a professional. So I think that last point to me is the most important one. And I think that is a lifelong journey in terms of how to have that type of humble swag, how to be vulnerable and realize that as a strength and not a weakness. So I think that's an important piece too. And I think my slides aren't moving. So I think that's the last slide. Oh, yes, it is the last slide. Anyway, I don't feel any of this is groundbreaking. I think, again, this is kind of my story and how I interpret it through a slide deck, but hopefully that's helpful for you all. And you're in the business of trying to identify talent and who are real authentic leaders in the roles that you're looking for. And I think hopefully this can be helpful in not only helping identify those people, but the coaching that you will do in the different opportunities that come with the organization that you serve. So, okay, who's a City Year alum? Kyle? Kyle Markham?
Yeah. We've actually got a couple here in at least in the DC office. So hey, Jeff, glad to have you around. I recognize some of that jargon as well. So yeah, I had a great time. City Year is just the absolute best.
Oh, I'm so glad. That's great. So I don't know what happens now, Jody. Is this
let's open it up questions if anyone, discussion, if anyone has any questions or wants to ask anything.
I'll bite.
one thing I've struggled with is I guess I would say authenticity on LinkedIn. I turn my profile on, I try to keep it active so people are finding me. And so much of what comes through is just surface level networking at the worst. How do you make it more authentic, or how do you navigate those waters faster? And have you had any success getting like real connections on a platform that's so surfacey?
Yeah, I've had plenty of those emails. I probably get at least one of those a day.
Yeah.
I think that's what you're referring to, right? People want to help out with different areas that they focus on in their business. I think that as much as I love LinkedIn, I think it has certainly limited utility in terms of the authentic piece. I think what's so powerful about it, though, and I think this is where our worlds have gotten so small, is once you tell me a name, especially if they're involved in some type of business context of what I'm doing, one of the first things I do is look at LinkedIn, right? I want to just kind of get background. And I also want to know who's in that person's relationship world. And so I think, again, that's critically important for us to really understand that, like, it's not, I mean, my goodness, it's almost scary, really, how you can just put a name on a table and say John Smith and lives in DC and works at this place, and how much information you can get on that person. But I do think that LinkedIn is susceptible to the business propositions and people that are trying to sell you something. And honestly, I think that really does speak a lot to kind of the network mentality that people oftentimes have, when doing this. Like it amazes me oftentimes that someone would even reach out and think that I'm gonna reply to them, say, "Oh, I have a great B2B opportunity for you, how we can support you in such and such." There's nothing authentic about it whatsoever, and I think that sometimes, because networking can be so transactional, that people jump right to the chase before they even spend any time building relationship. I had I mentioned I teach at University of Maryland, and one of the students, I think he was a grad student, had reached out to me. I never met him before, but he knew me through probably the university and me having taught. Maybe he had friends that took my class, and he had asked to speak with me about a nonprofit that he started. And so I agreed to listen to him. We hopped on the Zoom call, and within 2 minutes, he asked me if I was willing to join their board. And I said, whoa, stop. I was like, you cannot ask me to join your board. You don't know me. We haven't built any relationship. This is a very big ask to ask someone to join a board, to commit their limited and precious free time to an organization. Like, you need to build a relationship with me first. So my answer is no, I'm not interested in joining your board now, but spend some time building a relationship with me. Let me see that you're invested, and not just say, "Oh, this is a name that's a professor that runs the organization, so I'm going to ask them to join the board." And I think that's just a learning lesson. I think that sometimes, well, not just young people, I think adults too, but I think certainly young people need to understand in terms of how to build relationships. I know it just sounds like so simple and 101, but I don't find a lot of people that are really authentically good at it. And I think it's our nature to build relationships authentically, but I think we're in such a fast-paced society. Everything is on clicks and social media, that sometimes we lose that art of being able to properly, build an authentic relationship with somebody. So I don't have an answer to how you avoid those things that happen on LinkedIn. But I will say that I try to really think out of the box when it comes to building a relationship. So, like, sometimes I think people will look specifically for how this person particularly directly impacts what you do or could be doing. And certainly that's in the back of my head when it comes to work. But I'm also thinking, well, we share the commonality that we all share in this room, is that's our humanity. And that's intriguing enough for me to have a conversation without expectations of what's going to happen in the second conversation, even if there is one. So I think it's that curiosity and inquisitiveness about people and what you can learn from them that allows you to, like, build a huge relationship world. And I think about this as I look at this room. Again, it's very simplistic, but everyone in that room has a relationship world. And I'd be willing to guarantee that with many of you, I probably have overlap in terms of a relationship I have that you also have. I mean, learned that Kyle did city year. I mean, it happens invariably. And I think, again, as an indication of how small our world has gotten. But the larger your relationship world becomes, and I learned this firsthand, like especially my last 6 years of city year, my relationship world got to a point, specifically within the DMV, to a size where I felt like I could make anything happen, right? Not just with fundraising, but I would talk to staff members and say, if you're having struggles with X, Y, and Z, or trying to secure this building, or trying to get this person to speak to your people, just come let me know. I can't guarantee I can make anything happen, but I feel like I either have a relationship with that person or someone associated with that you can make something happen. And that is transferable everywhere. It's not just there, it's any organization you're with. The stronger, the larger, and the more solid your relationship world is, the more you can make magic happen in so many different ways.
Jeffrey, I have a question. I'm here in the DC office, and it's around social media. Many candidates ask about, should they share their political beliefs on Twitter, on Facebook, and I have my own personal opinion of where I think it can help you and where I think it can hurt, but I'd love to hear your perspectives on sort of sharing that aspect of your identity and I guess more publicly.
Yeah, it's a great question. I know some people have different perspectives on this. I am obviously, when you're talking about a Facebook and a LinkedIn, they're two very different platforms in terms of what you'd be sharing. And so I think, like, politically, I don't really share anything on Facebook. If something happened that really kind of touched me or really impacted me in some emotional way, I would make reference to it. Not necessarily like stating a political, but just what my value system is, right? And I try not to bring politics too much into my value system. But I think even on, Facebook, I think I'm pretty particular about what I want to be sharing about what's going on in my own personal world. I think when I'm on travel, I oftentimes like sharing because I know there's friends and family that will know what I'm doing, and that's kind of fun to do. But certainly, you probably have experienced it, right, with candidates where they were a candidate for a job, and then people started doing some metadata, exploring about their Facebook, and they come up with all kinds of crazy stuff. I'm just not a believer in it, but I'm also from probably a different generation where I think young people are sharing so much on social media. I want to share what is in integrity with who it is that I am, my personal value system, and not random, off the cuff kind of stuff. So that's my perspective on it. I'm not saying that's necessarily the right one, but I do feel like my gosh, when you talk about validation, that's kind of the essence of social media, right? We want to get those likes. They've done research on what type of psychological effects, even to your neurons, when you get a like on something that you post in social media. So it's addictive. And so I feel for young people really that this has been part of their reality since they came into this world. And I think it's a wonderful thing to be acknowledged and liked. We all need it. I think it's a dangerous thing when we need it, going back to what I said earlier. And so I just think that as professionals that are in this space where all information is public, I think when it comes to your things like Instagram and Facebook and the other social media platforms, I think people should be kind of judicious on what it is they want to share with the world.
Jeff, it's interesting listening because we also have the opposite. When people, building your brand, when people don't have a social media presence on Instagram or Facebook, which does happen often, when we're doing media scrubs for candidates, that's also frowned upon because then we're asked, what is their brand? Where is their brand? So it's a dance to get it right, that you're visible. And that you're sharing the right thing. It's almost, we almost need an instruction guide, because if you're trying to build your career, it's different than trying to build your personal identity.
True. Yeah. I do remember at City Year, I had a Twitter account, an Instagram account just for City Year. So I was posting all the time professionally, right? So I go to an event, I visit a school, and I was posting, because I knew that was good for the organization. But but it's true, right? You look at the social media right away when you start looking at candidates. It's hard not to. And so I do think there is an intentional way to build that brand, but I also think that's also like just so a sliver of the story. You know, I always say that like, and I'm sure you experience this all the time, right? Like once you make a final decision on a candidate for a job, you're still rolling the dice. No matter how much research you've done, how well that person interviewed, you don't really know what that person's going to be like until they get into the seat. And I think that speaks a lot to when you look at like social media or your LinkedIn and you see how impressive their background may be. I want to know what that person's all about. I mean, the person that we hired in an organization that I've been an interim at for a while, we did everything, all the interviews virtually, you know, and it wasn't until I met this person at the very end of the process when we were already at the stage of making an offer that I met the person in person. And for better or for worse, my perspective was radically different after meeting in person than it was virtually. And so I do think you need to take social media certainly with a grain of salt, you know, when it comes to in person, you just can't compare. Just like us being virtual right now, there's no comparison to us actually sitting around the table together.
Anyone else?
I've stupefied everyone. They're just like trying to take it all in. I do appreciate seriously the time that to have with you all. I actually, you know, just my exposure and experience with Korn Ferry has been very much through Jody and her associates that I've been able to be around, and really respect the work that you do. I've worked with a lot of search firms, and I'm always connecting Jody to folks in my relationship world that I think would be good candidates. So I appreciate the work that y'all do, and pretty humbled that I got invited to do this. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Steph. And we appreciate all those connections, many of whom become candidates. So keep sending them and building our relationships. And thank you so much. We appreciate it. Thanks for all the information you shared. And thanks everybody for joining.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks.
My pleasure.
So I've seen candidates miss out both ways, like if they're not